Ich darf Sie im Namen des Walter-Eucken-Instituts hier zu den Hayek-Tagen 2014 begrüßen. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass wir mithelfen durften bei der Organisation der Hayek-Tage. Sie erwartet im Anschluss an den Nachwuchsworkshop, den Sie eben gesehen haben, wohl eine Reihe intensiver Diskussionen über den Zustand freiheitlichen Denkens in dieser Zeit, insbesondere, aber nicht nur im deutschsprachigen Raum. Ich hoffe sehr, dass die aktuellen Bedrohungen der Freiheit in wirtschaftlicher Hinsicht nach dem Wiedererstarken staatlicher Steuerungsfantasien im Zuge der Finanzkrise und bezüglich privater individueller Freiheitsrechte schon seit 9/11 im Zuge des Krieges gegen den Terror auf den diesjährigen Hayek-Tagen zur Sprache kommen werden. Ich hoffe, das baut man jetzt. Ich hoffe sehr, dass man das jetzt nicht aufbaut, dass man uns nicht mehr sieht. Aber ja. Hinsichtlich des ersten Aspekts der wirtschaftlichen Bedrohungen setze ich auf Rainer Hank. Hinsichtlich des zweiten Aspekts auf die morgige Podiumsdiskussion. Ich hoffe sehr, dass wir intensive Debatten haben werden. Ohne Herrn Hank vorgreifen zu wollen, erlaube ich mir 2, 3 Bemerkungen gleichwohl. Meines Erachtens ist die wirtschaftliche Freiheit gegenwärtig massiv unter Druck. Ich habe eben am Ende des Nachwuchsworkshops noch ein bisschen was über Rundfunkgebühren hören dürfen. Bei den finanziellen Auswirkungen anderer Entscheidungen sind wir in ganz anderen Dimensionen. Und das gilt weltweit. In den USA verschreibt sich die Federal Reserve weiterhin mit ihren unkonventionellen Maßnahmen der Steuerung der Wirtschaft in einem Maße, wie man es seit den 70er Jahren nicht mehr gesehen hat. Der amerikanische Präsident vermag es zwar unter dem großen Druck des Kongresses, seine expansive Fiskalpolitik etwas abzuschwächen. Er braucht diese Hilfestellung offenbar. Gleichwohl wird die amerikanische Schuldengrenze regelmäßig nach oben angehoben. Also wir sind weiterhin in einer Situation expansiver Geld- und Fiskalpolitik in den USA. Und man ergötzt sich im Land der unbegrenzten Möglichkeiten ganz besonders stark an den Thesen von Thomas Piketty, dem französischen Ökonomen, der deutlich mehr Einkommensumverteilung haben möchte und an große Vermögen ran möchte. Wenn wir bei Frankreich sind, in Frankreich, man kann auch sagen, im ganzen lateinischen Teil der Europäischen Union ist man der marktwirtschaftlichen Reformen müde, obwohl ein Teil dieser Länder, ich meine Italien und Frankreich hier, damit noch gar nicht begonnen hat. Die Fortschritte in Irland, Spanien, Portugal und Griechenland sind da. Sie werden gerade von diesen Ländern in der Europäischen Union kleingeredet. Denn nicht nur in Italien und Frankreich will man die Erfolge dort, also in den anderen Ländern, die reformiert haben, selbst für die konjunkturelle Entwicklung nicht wahrhaben, um unter dem Stichwort Wachstumspolitik nur noch mehr Schulden machen zu können. Wachstum gleich Schulden. Die Vergangenheit, ich habe gelernt, dass man das anders ausdrücken muss, nämlich wissenschaftlicher, die überwältigende Mehrheit empirischer Studien belegt, dass dies falsch ist. Wachstum ist nicht gleich Schulden. In Deutschland sekundieren wir den Reformlahmen und Reformmüden auf fast schon unverzeihliche Weise. Etwa wenn der Vizekanzler, wie schon einer seiner Vorgänger das im Jahr 2003 gemacht hat, die europäischen Fiskalregeln in Frage stellt, gerade erst letzte Woche passiert. Reformen müssen nicht finanziert werden, sie müssen durchgeführt werden, wenn es sein muss, gegen Partikularinteressen. Deutschland sekundiert weiter durch eine neue Welle des Staatsinterventionismus, Mindestlohn, Mietpreisbremse, Rentenpaket, und zwar in beiden Dimensionen, Mütterrente wie Rente mit 63. Die Mütterrente ist das teurere Element dieses Pakets. Sie werden für Investitionshemmnisse sorgen. Der Patient Deutschland, der vor nicht allzu langer Zeit der kranke Mann Europas war, er wird wieder rückfällig. Sollten sich Ökonomen zynisch die Hände reiben, weil sie in ein paar Jahren auch in Deutschland wieder Hochkonjunktur haben werden? Ich denke nicht. Freuen muss man sich darüber nicht. Es war Anstrengung genug, die Situation in Deutschland zu bereinigen. Diese Zeit wird aber kommen. Wenn der Patient rückfällig ist, dann wird man uns wieder stärker benötigen als heute, wo es ja schon ausreicht, in einer Prognose fürs nächste Jahr ein paar Zehntelpünktchen daneben zu liegen und die ganze Wissenschaft wird zur Seite gefegt. Das geht weiter. Denn es gibt viele Kräfte in dieser Bundesregierung, die der Ansicht sind, dass Innovationen in der Wirtschaft nur zustande kommen durch Staatsinterventionismus. Dass wir also beispielsweise verdeckte Subventionen über die Förderung erneuerbarer Energien brauchen, um Windkraft offshore zu fördern als zukunftsträchtiges Produkt. Es hat ja in der Solarbranche in Deutschland so gut funktioniert. Ich wäre aber auch froh, wenn die liberalen Kräfte in Deutschland den Reformskeptikern nicht allzu sehr mit fatalistischen Haltungen sekundieren würden nach der Devise Austritt aus dem Euro. Nach diesen holzschnittartigen Bemerkungen, die bestimmt, ich hoffe zumindest bei dem einen oder anderen etwas Nachdenkliches auslösen, will ich zu dem erfreulicheren Teil meines Grußworts kommen. I don't want to be a doomsayer this afternoon only, Jeff. Rather, I want to live up to the pleasure of introducing Professor Geoffrey Brennan to you. Jeff, when preparing this little welcome address, I consulted your Wikipedia entry. I have had to realize that you presumably celebrate your 70th birthday this year. In September, that's true. So we cannot congratulate you in advance, but I was still surprised to see that this is finally coming to you. I just wait until later during the year. In this entry, Geoffrey Brennan is noted as an Australian philosopher, if it were only such. Jeff indeed teaches philosophy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, but he also teaches political science at Duke University. Moreover, he is a faculty member at the Research School of Social Sciences at Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. I guess faculty member somehow implies some form of retirement. I wished retirees in Germany would be as retired as you are, meeting you at conferences, listening to your talks, reading your papers. We have just introduced a new retirement age of 63 for people working 45 years and longer. Despite all transdisciplinary transgressions, I prefer to call Geoff Brennan an economist. So in the classical sense, with roots in philosophy, and in the political economy sense that this implies. Geoffrey Brennan is one of the leading scientists in the public choice tradition. The first non-American to become a president of the Public Choice Society. A member of the Mont Pelerin Society, he is also a classical liberal. I could now start counting, as many economists usually do, me included, at such occasions. When you introduce a speaker, everything that has been done by the person you introduce. For example, 9 books, over 100 journal articles, all the prizes and awards, other achievements, your employment history, showing you where Geoff Brennan were during his career in all the different places. And of course I could do that. But I rather prefer to impose my preferences on this audience. You know, economists like to behave as benevolent dictators, even if they criticize it somewhere else. I would like to share 2 thoughts of Geoffrey Brennan with you, which have inspired me for many years and still do so. The first thought is from The Reason of Rules, jointly written with James Buchanan. In the first chapter, which according to the introduction Jeff has drafted, the authors start with economists' unsatisfactory introduction of economics, of their discipline, by relying on a Robinson Crusoe economy. It is an economy without rules. And then they state, I quote, we require rules in society because without them, life would indeed be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, as Thomas Hobbes told us more than 3 centuries ago. Only the romantic anarchist thinks that there is a natural harmony among persons that will eliminate all conflict in the absence of rules. There is indeed another normative aspect in rules that Jeff and Jim later in the introductory chapter alludes to. Outcomes are evaluated differently depending on how they come about. Procedural fairness matters, and I quote again, any outcome may be acceptable provided the rules are fair and are adhered to. I would like to contrast this thought with another one published in Is Public Choice Immoral? Again, written with James Buchanan and published in the Virginia Law Review 3 years after The Reason of Rules in 1988. The authors are discussing as to how the politics without romance notion of public choice, I could say, is cynical and thus makes prophecies that threaten to become self-fulfilling. And I quote again, "But what is intriguing in this connection is that the most intense resistance to public choice analysis arises from precisely those critics who cannot think in terms of constitutional alternatives. For such critics, it is apparently impossible to conceive of institutional arrangements within which political agents are constrained. They must then face a genuine dilemma. They must either model political man as he is and so live with Schumpeterian despair, or model man as he should be and seek to make their dreams come true. Should we really be surprised that so many choose the second of these options?" So first, we shouldn't be surprised that I chose accordingly. But you shouldn't be surprised if politicians behave as we have always thought they did. Actually, what we currently observe is that they would like to abolish the rules they should live to. And they would return to times that were darker and provided us with less favorable results. Geoffrey Brennan will talk to you about Friedrich August von Hayek's Conservatism. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I think before I begin, I should do something in German. So here it is. Im wunderschönen Monat Mai, als alle Knospen sprangen, da ist in meinem Herzen die Liebe aufgegangen. Downhill from there. That has nothing to do with what I'm going to say. But let me say that it is a great pleasure to be here. I'm honoured to be here with you and to have this opportunity to talk about Hayek's conservatism. I do have a paper. I'm not going to read the paper. I'm simply going to speak to it. But it's very convenient for me to have the opportunity of talking to you who know Hayek and Hayek's work so well, because in the recent past I've become interested in the idea of conservatism as a political philosophy. And it's important that I emphasise that it is conservatism as a political philosophy, because there's this curious difference between practices in political theory departments in political science and political philosophy. In political theory departments in political science, lots of people talk about conservatism. But in political philosophy departments, not very many people talk about conservatism at all. In fact, conservatism is almost invisible. And that's something that my ambition is to try to rectify. My ambition is to try and persuade political philosophers that there's something very interesting about conservatism, which I think has largely been ignored among the philosophers. And I'll say a little bit in passing about why I think that might be so. But Hayek's particular little essay, that appendix that appeared in the Constitution of Liberty, is a terrific place to start this analysis, because unlike many advocates of conservatism, critics of conservatism, which Hayek sees himself to be, take the trouble to define the material that they're dealing with. And I think that Hayek gets conservatism pretty well right as far as it goes. My claim is that he doesn't go far enough, and that essentially what I'll be doing is taking the positions, the observations, the very astute observations that Hayek makes about conservatism, and pushing them a little further. Okay. Now, one of the things I should say at the outset is that the exercise of trying to re-represent conservatism as a political philosophy in general doesn't endear itself to the conservatives. Conservatives by disposition are rather anti-analytic. So the traditions of modern philosophy are not ones that they may deal with their material historically, but they've often seemed to feel that analysis involves a kind of reductionism or a foundationalism, an appeal to foundationalism, and they've always had this strong anti-foundationalist streak. So what I want to do is to just run through Hayek's analysis, but I'll start at the end with a remark that Hayek makes, which I think is representative of many political philosophers. And he says this: I'll often quote from Hayek, and when I quote from this essay, I'll go this way so that you'll know that I'm quoting. At the end of the essay, Hayek expresses a doubt as to whether there can be such a thing as a conservative political philosophy. As Hayek sees it, conservatism may often be a useful practical maxim, but it doesn't give us any guiding principles which can influence long-range developments. He thinks conservatism may help us to understand what is now politically possible, but it doesn't provide any general principles of the kind that would be required of a genuine political philosophy. Now, I want to raise just a quibble in passing about this about what Hayek says here, because I want to emphasise the fact that if there are general things that one can say about what is politically possible, and it seems to me implausible that any social theorist would think otherwise, including Hayek, then one might well think that political philosophy ought to absorb such considerations into its general principles. To take a slightly ad hominem example here, if there are limitations on what well-meaning, assuming they are well-meaning, social planners can know, you'd think that those limitations ought to be reflected in the general principles with which the analysis of alternative political arrangements ought to reckon. In other words, it's not enough for a political philosophy to declare what the ends of political activity are. We have to know something about the constraints under which political institutions operate. It seems to me that often political philosophers forget that there is a political reality out there, and that that reality bears on the proper designation of the principles that ought to be used to guide our actions in the face of the ends that we have. But what Hayek does here, when he emphasises the importance of, as it were, the ends, is he echoes, or he reflects, simply something that is characteristic of contemporary political philosophy, namely that when you look at political philosophy, it's full of liberalisms in their various classical and modern American guises. There's egalitarianism, there are various theories of justice, there's utilitarianism, there's communitarianism, and all these specify, in some sense, what what aspect of the political landscape, as it were, we ought to be focusing our normative attention on, and what ought to be promoted. And conservatism doesn't do this. Hayek's right. And it's actually this point, this failure to specify an end, that represents the centrepiece of Hayek's critique of conservatism. As he puts it, this is a long quote. "Let me now state what seems to me the decisive objection to any conservatism which deserves to be called such. It is that by its very nature it cannot offer an alternative to the direction in which we are moving. It may succeed by its resistance to current tendencies in slowing down undesirable developments, but since it doesn't indicate another direction, it can't prevent their continuance. It has, for this reason, invariably been the fate of conservatism to be dragged along a path not of its own choosing. The tug of war between conservatives and progressives can only affect the speed, not the direction, of contemporary developments." Now, I want to focus just on this last sentence. Note that the opposite of conservative that Hayek appeals to here is not liberal, it's not utilitarian, it's not egalitarian, it's progressive, or as I prefer to describe it, radical, or perhaps idealist. And just like progressive, conservative is in the first instance to be understood adjectivally. So I want to say that Hayek is absolutely right to claim, to observe, that conservatism as such does not offer an end, a direction in which to move. But he's one way too quick, I think, to regard this as decisive grounds for its rejection. On the contrary, I think that Hayek, despite his protestations to the contrary, arguably is, certainly could be, conservative in the sense that his analysis, properly pursued, suggests. Well, I'd better fix the target, so I'd better define what I'm taking conservatism to be. So I shall define a conservative as someone who treats the status quo as having some normative authority by virtue of its being the status quo. That's a sort of reduced form of the... And I take that this is what Hayek has in mind when he talks of the conservative as having a distrust of the new as such. That's a quote. A dislike of too rapid change in institutions and public policy, and is urging the case for caution and slow progress. So, I want to say a few things about this particular definition. First, the claim is that the status quo has some normative authority. That is, the preference for the status quo doesn't exhaust the normative domain. That's why it's appropriate to think of the conservative as, in its adjectival form. One might be, on my reading, a conservative classical liberal, or a conservative egalitarian, or a conservative utilitarian, as distinct from the radical or idealist or progressive counterparts. And we might do because conservatism expresses not something about the political end, but about the posture towards that end. Conservatism makes claims about why a certain posture towards the end that you are pursuing is the appropriate one. And this brings me to my first point, really, that Hayek sets his essay as a kind of conflict between classical liberal and conservatism, and partly for reasons, as we will recall, because so many people sort of seem to confuse the terms. But the general effect of his essay is to insist that these two positions occupy different places in, as it were, the logical plane. He puts it this way, here's another extended quote. The picture generally given of the relative position of the three parties, he's thinking of liberal, socialist and conservative, does more to obscure than to elucidate their true relations. They're usually represented as different positions on a line, with the socialists on the left, the conservatives on the right, and the liberals somewhere in the middle. This is still Hayek. Nothing could be more misleading, says Hayek. If we want a diagram, we do want a diagram, I've got this here for a diagram, it would be more appropriate to arrange them in a triangle, with the conservatives occupying one corner and the socialists pulling towards the second and the liberals towards the third. I think this is absolutely right. And I like this diagrammatic reference because its implication is that the conservative radical distinction involves a different dimension of political value than the one that is captured by, say, the socialist liberal distinction. The latter is indeed, socialists versus liberals, they differ about any sort. But the former, the one between radicals and conservatives, that's something different. Something that deserves, I think, to be uncovered and analysed independently. And let's just note in part that if this is true, if conservatism lies, as it were, in a different plane, along a different dimension from the liberal socialist divide, then there can't be anything necessarily inconsistent or indeed particularly problematic about being a conservative libertarian. The clash here would not be with something else, or some non-libertarian, but with the radical libertarian. Okay? And I take it that the conservative libertarian has points of difference with the conservative socialist, just in the same way as he has points of difference with the radical libertarian. But it's the conservative radical dimension that I think needs to be understood. Now, before I go on and try and explicate this distinction, I want to make a couple of other remarks about the definition that I used. So I've already observed that conservatism doesn't exhaust the normative domain, that conservatives will have an end, it's just that that's only a part of their total political portfolio, as it were. The second thing I want to emphasise is that the affection, to the extent that that's what it is, that conservatives have for the status quo doesn't arise because of substantive properties of the status quo. It arises, as it were, by virtue of the status quo being the status quo. So a hardline communist from 1988 East Germany might want to hang on to the established order because it's communist, because of its substantive properties, not because it's the status quo. That is, the status quo just incidentally happens to exhibit features that you happen to like. That's a reason for hanging on to it, but that's a reason that's embedded in the ends that you have specified. You like the status quo because it's equal. You like the status quo because it has a large government, or what have you. I take it that the conservative is opposed to certain changes from the status quo even when they're directed towards ends that the conservative supports. And this is a point that's emphasised actually by a rather nice little book by Torbjörn Tange, I guess that's how you pronounce it, he's a Swede, who wrote a little book called Conservatism for Our Time, I think it's called. I think he gets that aspect of conservatism right. It's not the substantive properties of the status quo, it's something about the status quo in and of itself, whatever the status quo happens to be. There's another important point to notice here. You know, I've talked about the status quo, but the status quo isn't self-defining. Status quo has many features, and there's an issue as to which of the many features of the status quo the conservative seeks to preserve. The focus on conservatism as a political philosophy will have to restrict that domain somewhat, but that restriction won't help us much. So just think of a simple example. Suppose that the world price of some commodity plunges and that this development threatens to put out of business a significant number of firms in the domestic industry. An outcome conservative will want to preserve the status quo in terms of substantive conditions. That is, try and maintain, let's say, the industry, employment in the industry by instituting a tariff on the import of the commodity or insulating the industry from the effects of this change in the world price in some way. So that's an outcome conservative. A policy conservative, by contrast, will want to hold the existing free trade or whatever it is, policy regime in place unchanged. An institutional conservative, well, she might insist that we hold constant the basic institutions of society, so that if the political pressure within the existing democratic institutions proves irresistible and the government caves in and has a policy change which does protect the industry to some extent, she will say, well, we have to let democratic institutions take their course. That's institutional conservatism. And I take it that any person who expresses affection for the status quo is going to have to specify whether they're an outcome conservative or a policy conservative or an institutional conservative, and why. One final preliminary thought before I get to the diagrams and such. Conservatism almost certainly does come with its repertoire of emotional and psychological support. People often have a taste for the familiar, they have ingrained social habits that lead them to want to hold the things that they like unchanged, perhaps holding them the same unless the weight of argument for change is sufficiently heavy. And certain kinds of substantive political philosophies, preference-based utilitarianism, for example, will regard this taste for the familiar as something that ought to be taken into account just because it's part of individuals' preferences. It's a feature of individuals, and to the extent that we ought to reflect those features in what we do, then we ought to be conservative. But I take it that the question that's relevant for developing conservatism as a political philosophy is not whether people do or don't have a disposition to favour the status quo, but rather whether they should have it. The challenge is, in a sense, to justify whatever emotional apparatus defends the status quo, if it does, or perhaps to indicate why one should develop that emotional apparatus if one doesn't have it. What I want to do now is to try to sharpen the distinction that I've gestured at so far and in order to do so, I'm going to draw a diagram. It's not Hayek's diagram, it's my diagram. But I love diagrams. I think diagrams are very informative, and I'm going to use one here. Okay, I'm going to have two dimensions in my diagram. You'll have to tell me if you can't read this. Is this legible? The side. On the vertical axis, I'm just going to put value, and on the horizontal axis, well, I'm not going to be too specific about what's going along that horizontal axis, social states, attributes of the world, something of that kind. And I'm going to, it's called domain. Domain. This is exactly, the domain of evaluation. And of course, I'm doing this because it's of the nature of the exercise that different individuals will have different domains of evaluation. Okay? Egalitarians will focus on equality. Equality of what? Asks Sam. Well, equality whatever the egalitarian theory specifies. And so, that will be the thing that is the object of value. And here, what I'm going to do, just to draw the distinction that I need to draw, is to assume that there are two individuals who are both classical liberals. They're libertarians, if you like, if that term captures all that's involved in classical liberalism. So, their specification of the ideal point in this domain is exactly the same. There it is. And it has exactly the same value for the two people. These people are very, very alike. And there's a point that's the worst imaginable point. Now what I want to call that, N for nada. You know that word. There's the min. Okay. And these two people are alike in another respect. That is that they assess the distance, the domain between the worst possible imaginable outcome and the ideal outcome in the same way. They have a metric of distance, which is exactly the same for both of these individuals. And here is the relevant distinction. This guy has a value function that's like that. It's like a sort of smooth hill, steep at the bottom, and as you get towards the top, it flattens out and it reaches its maximum at this highest value point, the ideal. And this is to be contrasted with this guy. So here we have two kinds of value functions which are fixed at the same endpoints, the worst possible imaginable point and the best possible point. Okay? But they differ. They differ in the way in which they value the intermediate points relative to those extremes. Okay? And I'm going to call this one conservative, and this one, well, what word will we use? Radical. That guy is radical, this guy is conservative. And here is the status quo, poised somewhere between the extremes of maximal desirability, the ideal, the world is not perfect, and the worst possible imaginable outcome. The world is not as bad as it could be. That's the predicament we're in. Okay. And what's important here is the posture, as I call it, which each of these individuals brings to the value that she holds. Okay, they hold the same value, the same point in the domain. They value it the same way. They have the same perception of what the worst possible state of the world is. They know how far they are from the best possible world and the worst possible world, and they agree on that. They agree on lots of things. But they're different in this respect. Okay, that one has a convex shape over the whole range, and one has a convex shape. One convex from below, one convex. One concave from below, one concave from above. I might as well get it right. Okay, so that's the difference, and now the question is, well, what's the upshot of this difference? Just to observe that they might be like this may or may not be particularly interesting. Well, in particular, as most of us probably know, the characteristic feature of curves of this kind is that they differ with respect to attitudes to risk or uncertainty. So, if you consider somebody with a new policy, okay, this policy has a good chance of moving us towards our ideal. But if it doesn't work out, it's got an equal chance of moving us away from the idea by an equal distance. So it's a 50-50 chance whether we're going to move some distance towards the ideal or some distance away from the ideal. And the characteristic feature of the progressive, radical, idealist is that this will be a good bet. If there's a 50-50 chance of ending up there, and a 50-50 chance of ending up there, so this is S minus and S plus, the idealist will think that's a good deal. Okay? The upside benefits in terms of his value function are larger, characteristically larger. That's what the convexity does. Characteristically larger than the downside losses. Okay? Exactly the opposite is true of the conservative. For the conservative, a 50-50 chance of moving in the right direction or the wrong direction is a bad deal. Okay? The expected value of that 50-50 chance is there, but the actual value of staying at the status quo is greater than the expected value of a 50-50 deal of moving in to S minus or S plus. It's not that the conservative here doesn't know what moving in the right direction is. It's not that this libertarian doesn't care about the ideal. But the way in which the posture of the agent towards the ideal is different in this crucial respect, that for the conservative, upside gains are less significant than downside losses. For the radical, upside gains are more significant than downside losses. Now, this point about the conservative is just another way, slightly more diagrammatic way, of representing Hayek's observation that one of the this is a quote, one of the fundamental traits of the conservative attitude is a fear of change, a timid distrust of the new as such. Well, there's a crucial element of truth in that, okay? If the conservative is going to be persuaded that this particular policy is going to be a desirable one, the chances of the downside loss, or the size of the loss, the size of the move in a downside direction, have got to be small. Exactly the opposite is true of the radical. Exactly the opposite is true of the idealist. For the idealist, okay, if it moves in the right direction, then, you know, look, don't worry too much about the risks of bad things happening because they're not of very, very much value significance anyway. Now, there are three things at stake, I think, in this depiction. The first, a very Hayekian theme, is an awareness of the lack of human knowledge, especially in areas relating to the workings of policy and basic institutions. For many radicals, there's just sort of no issue, no uncertainty about the effects of their favourite policies or their institutional changes. To them, it's just self-evident that these things will be in the right direction. Conservatives, by contrast, tend to be highly alert to human limitations, both in knowing what the right thing to do is, though that's not embedded in this diagram, but more particularly here in predicting the effects of various changes on how the world will lie. And Hayek himself would certainly not be accused of the latter kind of unawareness. The socialist calculation debate, and much of Hayek's writings on the virtues of the market order, is driven by just this insistence on epistemic constraints. Hayek believes in unintended consequences. And these 5 past 6? 5 past 6? Well, 10. We'll go 10. Negotiate. Notice too that just the recognition that there are unintended consequences in itself won't mean anything unless you have a value function of the right kind. You have to have a conservative kind of value function to be really worried. Or put it a different way, conservatives are disproportionately worried about unintended consequences. Radicals don't worry about them so much. So if a conservative wants to argue with a radical, or somebody who thinks of themselves as a radical, then she can do it on 3 fronts. She can remind the would-be radical of the relevance of uncertainty about the effects of policies. Okay? And to the extent that radicals take the kind of posture they do towards their political ends because they fail to take adequate account of the possibility of mistakes, then they're in principle able to be persuaded. But conservatives may also accuse radicals of having the wrong attitude to the size of downside risks. Radicals might just fail to imagine how disastrous the world could be if things go in the wrong direction. And being persuaded that downside risk is possible, radicals may then be induced to think more seriously about how dire the consequences could be. Or, thirdly, I haven't talked about this, but conservatives might persuade radicals that their radicalism actually reflects the influence of a kind of framing problem. A problem of too much preoccupation with what the ideal is, and not enough concern with what the proper posture towards the ideal is. Much of political philosophy, this is an issue that's everywhere in the ideal, non-ideal debate. But much of political philosophy is interested in specifying I, telling you what I is. But we're not at I. Okay? The question, the real world question is giving us a direction in which to move, as Hayek puts it. Having a direction is not enough. You've got to know what the relative value of moves towards the ideal are vis-à-vis the possibility of downside losses. And that's what the conservative posture captures. Now, I've said that conservatism is associated with risk aversion, but I don't necessarily want to say that that risk aversion is foundational. I don't think that there's necessarily a one-to-one connection between, or I don't think that people think I'm risk averse, therefore I should be conservative. Rather, I think this emerges out of the structure of value, or it can emerge out of the structure of value. Okay. So, various kinds of familiar criteria, like Rawls's maximum, is notorious for being strongly risk averse. A 50-50 chance of an outcome where the worst off are down there or up there is for Rawls a bad deal. Because you've got to be concerned with maximising the worst off. So it's not just libertarians or egalitarians can be conservative. Preference utilitarians, I think, are conservative in this sense because of the nature of the value that they're maximising, not because of any intrinsic attitude towards risk. It's just a fact that if you move away from the ideal, it'll cost you more than if you move towards it. Now, the reason I haven't let Michael shut me up just yet is because I have another diagram. And in a way, this is, I think, the most interesting diagram of all. It's very like the first one. Again, we have a set of individuals who are very alike. But in this case, there are four of them. And they happen to have substantive differences about their ideals. They have different views. These are the libertarians, these are the egalitarians, let's suppose. The feature of the world that they pick out of normative concern is a different feature. Okay? And each of them feels just as intensely about their value as the other. Okay, so there are the two conservatives. Conservative libertarian, and this guy is the conservative egalitarian in my story. And the status quo is somewhere there, I suppose. So the characteristic feature is that we have a situation in which there's disagreement about the direction in which we ought to move. The egalitarian wants to move one way, the libertarian wants to move another way. Okay. But notice this interesting feature. I said that conservatives, one's a conservative egalitarian, one's a conservative libertarian. The use of the term conservative ought to be adjectival. But I'm now going to observe that these two guys have something in common. And that's this. That for both of them, they'd rather stay at the status quo than they would undertake a 50-50 deal in which one or other of them gets his or her personal ideal. So it's not that the libertarian guy doesn't want to get to his ideal. He does. But if the cost of getting to his ideal is having to put up with the ideal of the other guy, a risk of that, then that will lead him to compromise. There's a range of compromise possibilities for these guys. Okay? This is the expected value for one, this is the expected value for the other. These are people who will be inclined to compromise. Okay? They are what I like to think of as moderates. And they're moderates because even though they can both imagine better worlds, okay, they can also imagine worse worlds. The worst world for me is the one that you think's ideal. And so if you're a conservative socialist, a conservative egalitarian, I can do a deal with you. There are gains from exchange, as it were, between us both about staying in the middle, about compromising. Exactly the opposite is true of the radicals. There's no compromise possible with the radicals. And I think this is something that Hayek gets absolutely wrong in this paper. Because this is what he says. The conservative has no political principles which enable him to work with people whose moral values differ from his own for a political order in which both can obey their convictions. It's the recognition of such principles that permits the coexistence of different sets of values that make it possible to build a peaceful society with a minimum of force. On the contrary, the conservative, as I have described it, derived, as I see it, from Hayekian foundations. Okay, this is just what I think Hayek thinks. Okay, he does have moral principles that will allow compromise, moderation, make it possible to build a peaceful society with a minimum of force. The enemies here are the progressives, because they don't. The only deal that progressives can make that's profitable to them is taking turns. You guys have your best arrangement this week, we'll have our best arrangement next week. That's because their value function has peaked, okay, in the way it's convex from below. So, the conservatives don't, it's true, have any principled reason for compromise. Okay? It's not as if they're tolerant by disposition, they're tolerant by virtue of the shape of their value functions. Okay? They're pragmatically tolerant. And this brings me to the end of my talk, pretty much. The natural question to ask at this point is, given that a conservative classical liberal is a perfectly coherent idea, is Hayek to be understood as one? Is he a conservative or a radical in my typology? And I must say, I think the jury has to be out on this. You will know this better than I, actually. Because his explicit opposition to conservatism depends on his looking to conservatism to provide something which, by its nature, it cannot and does not seek to provide, which is a substantive political position. So liberalism as such can't oppose conservatism on that basis. To oppose conservatism, one has to be a radical or a progressive, to use his term. And I think that there's nothing intrinsic about the classical liberal position which requires progressiveness or idealism or radicalism. There is something which Hayek says in the body of the essay about the timidity of conservatives that's relevant here. He says this: "The liberal position is based on courage and confidence, on a preparedness to let change run its course, even if we cannot predict where it will lead." Well, I would say, if that's what Hayek's view is, that's true only of radical liberals. And I think it's a mistake to identify all liberals with that position. I think often liberals can and generally do predict where change will lead, not in terms of specifics, but in terms of the general effects of the change on the things that they care about, and most particularly on liberty itself. And any changes that might or also might not hit that target will strike the conservative liberal not as courageous and confident, but as reckless and foolhardy. And as I see it, there's nothing in the liberal lexicon as such that suggests or requires that they would be wrong to be cautious. Thank you very much.